will start anytime soon. Okay, ethical hacking. So for those people who don't know, I teach a undergraduate unit here at BU on ethical hacking and countermeasures. I kind of inherited this unit when I started at BU, but in my previous life at my alma mater, I once taught a tutorial course on cyber ethics. So I was quite intrigued by the idea of teaching a course on ethical hacking. So I figured, right, ethics and hacking. But what I found interesting was actually the small amount of work on ethics and ethical hacking. Because people say, well, ethical hacking, well, it's hacking which is right, for some value of the term right. So what I did, with some colleagues, John Marcani here at BU, Sarah Field, who was at MWR, and Claudia Jakob, who is now at Portsmouth, is we basically ran a study looking at what the ethical import of ethical hacking might be. And we came up with a few factors that shape the responses that professional penetration testers, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that, will deal with when they face ethical dilemmas. And we looked at how the different perspectives the pen testers might shape the responses they take. So we've got enough, we have published some of this stuff, so if you're really interested in the work, we can point you to the papers, but this is still a bit of, some of this work is still a little bit ongoing, so if you want to get involved and collaborate, there are always opportunities. Right, so by ethical hacking, what we mean is penetration testing. This is our working synonym. The idea of simulating real attacks to assess the risks associated with potential security breaches. So we are hacking in order to improve security. Now, the definition itself leans towards the idea that ethical hacking might be more morally acceptable. But when we start digging into this definition of simulation and attacks and security breaches, we understand, as Helen quite rightly pointed out, that hackers need technical prowess and creativity to find problems. Because when the folks were developing Unix way back in the day and they were thinking of memory models, the whole idea that someone might actually manipulate pointers never really entered into many people's heads. So depending on how fine-grained your simulation of a real attack is, you might inadvertently start behaving in an ethical manner. And if we look at simulating these attacks in a very broad sense, we might involve things like red team testing that include social engineering activities. And here, when we start dealing with things like deception, we absolutely run into all sorts of ethical issues. So even if you find the process is broken because somebody does something they shouldn't do, if you're debriefing the guard that's been caught out, it's no good saying we're not testing you, we're testing the process, because by the time the guy is upset and in distress, it's too late, that the damage has been done. But even if you think in terms of just technical testing, you can hit upon some quite interesting legal and ethical issues too. So this is a screenshot of a tool called the Harvester, one of the tools that come out of the box if you're using a Kali Linux distribution. I ran an exercise with some of my secondary ethical hacking students yesterday. Are any of them here? No? Okay, good. I gave them the brief of planning, not carrying out a spear phishing attack on me. So those people that haven't figured out yet, academics kind of put ourselves out there in terms of we want people to read our papers and do our work. So we are something of a target for spear phishing. Some of the attacks that people came up with were very, very plausible, and with slight modifications to the context and the infrastructure would have been actually eminently, well, they are significant enough that earlier today I did have a chat with Vasilis, our head of department, to say we need to have a chat about some of these attacks because these things could actually happen. But what is particularly interesting is that the attacks that were described were legal, so they could have been legitimately carried out as part of a pen test, but the ethical implications weren't that clear. So if you're trying to make a decision on the fly about whether I'm going to do business with this client on the basis of this particular bit of work, it could be quite random whether you do something which is or isn't ethical. So ethics is the study of morality. Really, it gives us theories, principles about what it means to do something right or what it means to be right. Penetration testing vivifies ethics because it gets people thinking about the consequences of an action. So I find that I've exploited this vulnerability, so what? I need to describe this as a risk to my client, and I care about the consequences and the context. Now, it seems then that this is a nice fertile space to do academic research, but there's not really a massive amount of work out there. I mean, people have written papers on the norms, morals of hackers. There's to Tom Holt's work. There's the stuff that sort of Helen is doing. People have talked about codes of practice and the idea that these are a little bit hard to contextualize. It's not really new. I mean, people who are members of the BCS or IEEE or ACM typically don't read their codes of conduct in great detail either. And there are some position papers that talk about tensions between ethics and other issues. So it's all mom and apple pie stuff. In the last few years, I've started to see some literature on penetration testing case studies. But the problem with this literature is that it's carried out by people who, quite frankly, don't understand what penetration testing is. So if you've got a guy that's basically writing a script to do some sort of testing, to an academic that might be, well, that guy is basically a penetration tester. So I only know the ones that actually come my way to review, but occasionally I see security conferences where people talk and prescribe issues around penetration testing without really understanding what penetration testing is. So we basically ran around a study. We found a whole bunch of what we call professional penetration testers. And by this, I mean people that hold current CREST credentials, for those people that know what CREST is, or people that hold some form of checker accreditation. So all the people we spoke to were in the UK. We did speak to a few government testers, and I can't say too much about who they work for. Some of these folks didn't have accreditations, but we did have long chats to make sure that they were at an equivalent level of expertise. We did actually turn a few people away, because what we wanted was a baseline. We wanted to make sure that all the people we interviewed were professional penetration testers, rather than a guy that had read a book on Kali Linux and had run some, had watched some YouTube videos on Mmap. So what we did is we did some interviews, did some grounded theory analysis, came up with a model not a million miles from this. We then applied some work we presented to the CHI a few years ago, which turned our grounded theory model into persona descriptions. Because the thing about grounded theory is that it's not really very exciting. But if we can batch it up in something a bit more approachable, it's more likely people are going to give us the feedback on our work. What we then did is we looked at some of the factors, and we came up with a scenario, a pre-mortem scenario, where something bad had happened, because some of the things we found in our model had actually happened. And we gave this scenario to about 20 professional penetration testers. Only a very small subset were part of our original sample, and we actually said, what were the reasons that this thing happened? And we actually got all the responses, and when we coded the responses just to see if the things that people said matched up with what we found in our original model. And by and large, they did. So what do we find? When we created the model, we found there were two clusters of behaviors around ethics in penetration testing. And what we did is we actually gave these clusters names, Ben and Matt. And these seem to live on some sort of ethical axes, where the x-axis said something about the value that testers had towards structured or unstructured approaches to testing. And the y-axis said something about the value that people had towards either individuals or personal values, or groups, communities, organizations, etc. So we built some personas around this. The personas are actually freely available. So they are on the bottom right. The videos is online, so hopefully you'll see the link there. What I should point out is that no position or no persona is any more virtuous than another persona. So we didn't care about who was right or wrong. We just wanted to understand what the positions were and the implications of these positions when faced with different dilemmas. So in the model, we also noticed certain factors that were influencing how Ben or Matt might actually respond to certain things. So the value that testers had in the notion of ethics as a topic, the ethical appeal, so the justification that a tester would take when it comes to doing something which has some ethical import, the focus that they might have on clients, and what they feel as responsibility to practice. So responsibility is a fairly common topic in the penetration testing. We'll talk about that fairly shortly. Right, so I'm going to go through each of these dimensions in turn and say a little bit about the differences between Ben and Matt, because we saw these factors in both clusters of behavior, but they were manifest in different ways. So one thing I would say is that pen testers take ethics really, really seriously. Not so much because they care about ethics, but they care about professionalism a lot. because they basically realised that if people don't trust them, they're not going to trust the practice, and if they don't trust the practice, they're not going to get any work. But there were some conflicting opinions. I mean, some folks said that the fear of unethical behaviour was so great that they wouldn't engage in certain practices. Whereas on the other hand, we had some folks that said, well, okay, as long as the client is basically happy, everything is good. But we didn't get so much of that. Well, we did see it occasionally. Now, if you look at Ben and Matt, or the clusters of behaviour characterised by Ben and Matt, Ben saw ethics as an interpersonal skill. So it was something that you would be trained, a little bit like giving a presentation. And typically, the term shadowing was used over and over again. So the idea that you've got a junior tester who's in the process of actually getting his crest credentials or check accreditation, and you'll go along with someone senior as part of a red team to sort of watch what's going on. Now, these shadowing activities are typically designed to ensure that the junior tester understands practices around vulnerability identification or threat models. But it's also inferred that they're going to figure out the right way to do engagement as well. So they were never actually designed to provide a form of ethics or training, but it's assumed that they do. We'll talk about the implications of that shortly. In the case of Matt, ethics is seen as a skill for honing legal senses. So if it's legal, it's ethical. So if something is morally ambiguous, we don't engage with the work because it isn't worth the risk. Which is fine if everything's clear, but some of the folks we spoke to actually work on international assignments where the legal jurisdictions aren't always the same. When it comes to ethical appeal, people justify what they do in general on a situational position. So arguments appeal to context. We base our decision based on the situation here and now. In general, Ben, or testers that appeal to this particular cluster of behaviors, has this view that being ethical is actually common sense. So we know the codes of practice exist, but it's common sense. So I know what it is because it's obvious. Problem with common sense, though, is that it isn't quite so common. So what happens is that people rely on shadowing to learn the trade, which is great as long as the person that you're actually shadowing is behaving in a morally appropriate manner, given the organisation and the target. So the result is that the prevailing theory guides the behaviour, which could be pretty random. If you look at Matt, the idea is that risks associated with the dilemma are clear when they're put in context. So the idea is that the Matts were generally a lot more experienced than Ben. But even though this is an appeal to a relativist ethical theory for those people who know what that is, which is an appeal to contingency, which is going back to the original issue, because it might be right to deceive a guard because the client's goals are upmost, but it's also right to protect the privacy and be respectful of the guard as well. So there's no obvious way of actually unpacking that situation. What I would say about client focus is that everyone cares about the clients, and by and large, everyone I spoke to wants to do the right thing for the client. But how that works is slightly different. Everyone is mindful of the Computer Misuse Act, but other bits of legislation are understood in a more or less hazy manner. So Ben's need to reactively manage people, because a lot of the people I spoke to said they encountered a little bit of passive aggressiveness in some situations and outright hostility and the others. So a lot of their thinking about the clients was basically driven by hostility they might face. So blue team, red team conflicts. So if you've got an experienced client manager, everything is usually good. But if everyone on a team is inexperienced, things get problematic. In the case of Matt or Matt type testers, it's all about duty of care to the client as a whole. So educating clients about the value of vendor penetration testing. Some of the issues here is that we did see instances where we presented dilemmas as part of the interview and people said, okay, it's the client comes first. Whereas actually in the cold light of day, you would probably want to inform a law enforcement agency first. So we had issues then where the position that someone had around ethics cared more about the client than the law. 5 minutes left. Everyone cares about the duty to practice, but how this is manifest is different. To Bend, it's basically about tools. It's assurance that I've got the right tools and the findings from our tool usage are fine and all good. For Matt, it's about assurance in information management, that I'm managing all the information properly. I could say more, but I'm running out of time. What we did found is that this model was quite good at explaining certain fallacies and biases, because they helped us unpack practices like sort of shadowing to explain them, in the language of our theory. So if you look at shadowing, and I've done exercises with students where I've given them a situation where shadowing is occurring, and a lot of people say, well, we're following, a junior tester is following Ben, so everything's all good. But if a senior colleague's behaviour is morally ambiguous, then a junior tester may not appreciate that the values gleaned are equally ambiguous. So the theory we came up with was quite good for explaining why shadowing can be useful from a practice/skills perspective, but not so good from, let's say, ethical education perspective. Finally, we saw some interesting examples of the fundamental attribution bias. Now, this has been an issue in HI security since the Why Johnny Can't Encrypt paper, where Alma Whitten said, we gave the findings to our client and everything was good, because they assumed that that a non-response was everything was good, rather than more realistically, a non-response was we don't actually care about your findings. So we had a number of people who said, yeah, it's all about informing the client, and if they don't get back to us, it's all good. Whereas it's entirely plausible that the client took the results and did nothing with it, because they needed the test to get some form of credentials of value to their other clients. A few take-home points before we lead into questions. Number one is, I think there are ethical threat models associated with ethical hacking that just aren't being explored at all. So as a security practice, we care about threat modeling a lot, threat modeling for 5G, threat modeling for higher education, but we don't think about threat models associated with practice. And I think absolutely there are threat models associated with ethics and ethical hacking. Number two is education on professional ethics for ethical hacking is almost non-existent. I could be slightly arrogant here by saying that we actually have material at Bournemouth University on this, but we've spoken to Crest companies and we made our material available. And I think I'm fairly confident that what we've come up with is as good as anything else out there. So in some respects, higher education has something of a responsibility, but I think there is room for more work here. Finally, we need more studies on professional penetration testing, where we actually work with professionals rather than someone that knows how to actually run up an Nmap, etc. So the work we've done is fairly complete, but there is room for collaboration if anyone's interested. Thank you.